Professor James Miller, what happened on March 25th, 1931?
March 25th, 1931, there were a number of black and white youth hoboing on a train in Depression-era America, heading towards the south. A fight broke out among whites and blacks on the train. Blacks won the fight, expelled most of the white hobos. The white hobos were outraged. They reported that they had been attacked. The report went out on telegraph wires when the train stopped outside of a small town in Alabama called Paint Rock. There was a posse waiting. They gathered up 9 young black men, and as they searched the train, they subsequently found 2 white women dressed in overalls, which was customary for women when they hoboed in Depression America. And shortly after, the 9 young black men were accused of rape.
And they became known as?
They became known as the Scottsboro Boys. And this became one of the most celebrated racial spectacles of the 1930s. And I would add that no other crime or supposed crime in the United States has been the subject of so many trials, retrials, convictions, reconvictions, reversals, and 2 major Supreme Court decisions as the Scottsboro case.
Right, well, we'll walk through that. This picture here, where was this taken?
That picture was taken shortly after the boys were arrested in Paint Rock, Alabama. It's become a kind of iconic photograph of the case, and it's one that was most widely circulated in the United States and abroad.
And why is it iconic in your view?
It's iconic because I think it captures so many aspects of the case even when it was not written about. The forlorn and bewildered expression of the boys themselves, as they were called, their poverty, the militarization of the trial as symbolized by like the armed guards that surrounded them, the total abjection of the scene itself.
If they were arrested in Paint Rock, how did this become known as the Scottsboro Boys case?
It became known as the Scottsboro Boys case because Scottsboro was the town in Alabama where the first trials were held. The boys were arrested on March 31st, 1931. Within 2 weeks, all of the boys had been tried. 8 of them had been convicted. 8 of them had been sentenced to death. It all converged in Scottsboro, Alabama.
And that happened within 2 weeks?
Within 2 weeks.
All-white jury? First jury?
All-white jury, which ultimately became the basis of one of the first Supreme Court decisions about the case.
Who defended them?
This is a good question because in some respects, no one in the town wanted to defend the boys. A lawyer was appointed named Stephen Roddy. Roddy was a lawyer of, let us say, suspect credentials. He was widely known to enjoy his liquor. He was not particularly well known for his judicial competence. He was distinguished during the case by his general reluctance to say much on behalf of the boys.
Who was the judge in the first case?
Good question. I had forgotten.
What is the town of Scottsboro like?
Scottsboro then and Scottsboro now is a very, very small town in northern Alabama. Scottsboro now is known because it is the site of the place where left luggage supplies are auctioned and sold. It's a pretty town. It's a sleepy town. And it's interesting because I have in fact talked to young people from Scottsboro who still talk about it in those terms, many of whom know or knew nothing about the case.
How many trials happened for the Scottsboro Boys?
The boys were separated and they were tried in batches. Someone like Clarence Norris, who emerges as one of the major voices whose accounts we used to talk about the case, was tried at least 3 times. Haywood Patterson, another defendant, was tried at least and convicted at least 3 times. There was variation because given the legal history of the case and the ways in which the boys were separated, some were tried and convicted more than others.
So what happened after that first case, which took 2 weeks? All the boys had been tried together.
They'd all been tried. Well, they were tried, in fact, in batches, so there were 4 different trials the first time around.
Okay. After that first case, 2 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
how did it get to the Supreme Court?
Through a series of winding procedures. There were debates among various groups about who was best qualified to represent and defend the Scottsboro Boys. There was sharp contention between an organization called the International Labor Defense, which was, the legal wing of the Communist Party, and the NAACP. The ILD, as it was called, won the right to defend the Scottsboro Boys. They won their loyalty. They got their approval. They also hired a very, very competent criminal lawyer, Sam Leibowitz from New York, who played a critical role in laying the groundwork for the case as it wended its way to the Supreme Court, the first one in 1932.
Professor Miller, how did it sit to have a court case in Alabama tried by a communist-funded Jewish white lawyer?
Not well in Alabama. Not well in Alabama, and all of these facts played a central role, I believe, in the way the case was perceived and the way the case was tried in Alabama. Leibowitz himself had to have at one point an armed guard to escort him, between when he was off duty during the trials.
So we go through the second series of trials.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to the Scottsboro Boys?
Second series of trials, this was the Decatur trials in 1933.
Why did they move it from Scottsboro?
I think that was more a question of simply the most available and convenient venue. There were no legal reasons behind that. But the judge in that particular case was a very, very fair-minded judge. And that judge, after hearing the testimony and the witnesses, in effect declared a mistrial, and ordered a retrial. That was in 1933, and that provided the foundation for yet another set of appeals, which again went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled on behalf of defendants in 1935. So between 1933 and 1935, there was a period of wait until these legal issues were resolved.
And during that time, were the boys all held in jail?
Yes, they were.
What were the ages of the Scottsboro Nine?
The Scottsboro Nine ranged in age from 13 to early 20s, 22 or 23. But collectively, all 9 of the Scottsboro Boys served over 100 years in prison. The first 4 were finally released after a series of legal maneuvers and behind the doors conversations and bargainings and deals in 1937. Others were held until the early 1940s and beyond.
So they all ended up with convictions?
They all ended up with convictions.
Go ahead.
In my book, I argue that the Scottsboro case does not legally come to an end until 1976, when Clarence Norris, one of the boys who had been paroled in the late 1940s, fled parole in the South, wound up working and living in New York under a different name, was finally given a pardon by then Governor George Wallace of Alabama as a result of appeals made to Governor Wallace by the NAACP and lawyers representing Clarence Norris. Clarence Norris was the only surviving Scottsboro boy to actually receive some form of legal redemption.
Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. What can you tell us about these two women?
Well, for me, Victoria Price is